I've always been drawn towards platformers ever since I was a little kid, even though back then I had no hope of getting anywhere near the ending of these games. But even if all I could manage was the tutorial levels, I would play those levels over and over again just to enjoy soaking in the worlds and to watch my little character bouncing around on the screens. So when I saw the glowing reviews that Donkey Kong Country Returns got, I was expecting to absolutely love this game, especially as the people who it seemed to most appeal to were the people who also grew up playing the same kind of difficult platformers that I grew up with. To my surprise though, I found that not only did I not enjoy the game as much as I was expecting, but it actually made me feel really mad. Obviously, if you're playing a more difficult game, you can sometimes get a bit frustrated with it, but I'm not used to feeling this angry at a platformer. So I thought it would be interesting to pause for a moment and try and work out what it actually is that's making me so angry about this game. Is there something wrong with the way that it's designed? One of the first things I noticed after I actually started to pay attention was that I kept randomly freaking out over holes and just falling into them for no apparent reason. This was quite strange because normally I don't have that kind of an issue in platformers. But thinking about it a bit more, I realised that this seems to be because of how heavy Donkey Kong is. It's quite difficult to build up momentum with him, and it also takes a while to stop. Now, normally with platformer characters, I'm used to being able to very easily correct my trajectory. If I start jumping towards a hole but then realise I don't want to be there, I can just back off and go back to where I was in the first place and everything's fine. So because of that, it doesn't really require you to think very far ahead. You can just jump and do the thinking later. But because Donkey Kong is so heavy, you really need to look before you leap. You've got to pay attention and decide where it is you're planning to go and how you're going to build up enough momentum to get there. Because if you just jump towards a hole without thinking about where you're going, quite likely the inside of that hole is exactly where you are going. This in itself certainly isn't a bad thing. It's quite interesting to play a game that requires you to think ahead a bit more than a lot of the platformers that I'm used to playing. However, what does make it frustrating is the way it's paired with level design that sometimes feel like it's actually contradicting this need to look ahead. What I mean by that is that some of the levels, quite a lot of the levels actually, will have hazards that appear very suddenly, or maybe the level will be shifting and altering as you go through it. This means that while you feel like you really need to be planning ahead, the game is requiring you to think on your feet and make knee-jerk reactions. And when you're using a heavy lump like DK, that can feel awful. Sometimes it felt to me like the levels were designed for a completely different character, or like they were just constantly changing the rules on me. And that really triggered a feeling of this game being unfair. There were also a bunch of small annoyances that I had, and I'm not going to go over all of the ones that I noted down because that would be a bit boring. But to give you a couple of examples, one that you will see fairly consistently throughout the game is the hitboxes of the enemies. The problem I have with these hitboxes isn't that they're the wrong size, it's actually that they are the correct size, the exact correct size. That might sound like a good thing, but the thing is that for a game to feel like it's fair, it usually needs to be biased very slightly in favor of the player. And when it comes to hitboxes, if your enemy's hitbox is exactly the same size as the model that enemy has, then that means that even if you just ever so slightly brush up against that enemy, you will take damage from it. And in a game where it's hard to build up momentum, that can be especially frustrating. And again, that's compounded even further when the level design has enemies appearing very suddenly. Another issue I had was related to the levels which require you to duck very suddenly. As I've mentioned before, the control stick on my 3DS is gradually dying, and it's not so good at registering down inputs. Obviously that's a problem on a level like that, but that isn't an issue with the actual game's design, that's an issue with my personal 3DS. What is an issue with the game's design, though, is what happens when you want to change from the analog stick to the D-pad. In most 2D 3DS games, if you want to go from using the analog stick to the D-pad or vice versa, literally all you do is move your thumb from one to the other and you're good. In this game, not only does it require you to go into the options to select which input you want to use, but it requires you to then get used to a completely different control layout, because these two input options are directly tied also to the two different options for the grab and the roll moves. So if you want to change between the D-pad and the analog stick, you have to almost completely relearn the controls, and that's ridiculous. I can see absolutely no reason for this at all. It's weird enough that they made it so that you can't just switch between these two freely like most games let you do. Thankfully, I did find that I liked the newer layout after I'd switched to using the D-pad, but it's still ridiculous that I had to get used to it at all. Another issue I had with the design that's a little bit bigger is the way it makes you learn some of the levels. There are some things which are quite hard to learn without dying. I'm sure some people will be able to play this game with much fewer deaths than I was able to. But for me, in order to learn certain things, such as which path to go on, for example, it was basically required that I had to die. And that in itself is absolutely fine. I just said that it's absolutely fine that I had to die, but we're talking about a video game. Anyway, the issue I have is that this game punishes you for learning in that way. After you reach that hazard or whatever and discovered that it kills you, you then get sent way back in the level and have one of your lives removed. And this, in combination with the fact that some of the parts of the level are just more challenging than others, meant that I was replaying certain sections over and over and over, and some of them even had stuff in them that you had to wait for. So you'd not only be playing these sections that you'd already beaten again and again and again, even though you already knew how to do them, but you'd be waiting for these various hazards or whatever to get out of your way, wasting even more of your time. Put like this, it might sound like the game is very unfair in that regard. But it's possible you've also noticed that what I'm describing here is actually a very common design choice in older games, such as the kind of platformers that I grew up playing, that I absolutely loved playing. So really, what is making me so angry about this? I think part of the issue there is that I felt like I was constantly fighting against Donkey Kong as I replayed these levels, making them more frustrating than they would have been otherwise. However, thinking about it some more, I started to realise that as many flaws as this game might have, the biggest problem of all wasn't with the game, it was with me. I had gotten impatient, and I was being unreasonably angry with the game just for being difficult. When I realised this, I decided to take myself over to one side and remind myself of the fact that I could be patient and enjoy games like this. And as silly as it might sound, having a conversation with myself like that really changed my perspective on the game. After I remembered my patience, I started to notice how beautifully the levels would flow after I started to get better at them. I started to really feel satisfaction from beating these harder levels. And even on those levels which required me to wait around, I started to notice myself getting into a rhythm with them that I found actually quite therapeutic. There was just enough tension to keep my interest constantly, but at the same time, the downtime and the game's great music combined to make me feel really relaxed as I was playing them. Which is not at all something that I was expecting when I first started playing this game. I do still have issues with this platformer, and there are still some levels that I absolutely hate. While I was recording the B-roll for this video, I intentionally played one of my least favourite levels again, and I didn't get to the end of it. I didn't have enough motivation to put up with those obnoxious enemy placements and the way they just leap out at you. There are still some design choices in that way that I really hate. But this game was a great reminder to me that difficult games can be so much fun if you have patience for them. And if you are into older games and more challenging platformers, then this is definitely worth giving a try. Even if I don't regard it as being my very favourite platformer. At the end of the day, this wasn't just fun for me. This silly game where you play as a gorilla trying to rescue his stash of bananas that got stolen from him did more than just give me a fun time. It actually reminded me to try and be a better person. And that's a lot more than what I expected to get out of it when I started playing. Thank you so much for watching all the way through this video. I hope you've enjoyed hearing my thoughts on this game. As always, please don't forget to dislike and unsubscribe. And don't you dare leave a comment down below, you utter... Oh my gosh, it has hands!